Hello everybody, I'm Dan Murrell here to talk about the series finale of Stranger Things, which aired last night on New Year's Eve, and a Happy New Year to you. I hope you enjoyed it, whether you spent your New Year's Eve in Hawkins and the Upside Down or not. Now, this is a spoiler review for the series finale, so if you have not yet seen the finale, then go watch it, come back and hear my thoughts on it. As you can see, I am still on the road, and I'll talk a little bit more about that once we get to the end of the video. But for now, let's get into my thoughts on the finale, which they're somewhat mixed for me. I didn't hate it. I certainly did not hate it, but I think that there was some room for improvement, which kind of mirrors my feelings about the season overall. So let's jump into it at the beginning. We picked up the finale pretty much where we left off, with the gang heading into the Upside Down to get to the Abyss to take down Vecna. And we started the episode with two different conversations, one between Elle and Mike, one between Elle and Hopper, about how this was going to be the last fight, and after that everybody was going to go, and Elle specifically, they were all going to go and live a happy life. And I think that probably should have been the first clue that that sort of storybook ending probably was not going to be in the cards for these characters, but I think it's a little bit, well, they left it ambiguous. We'll get to that. We also had some resolution between Mike and Will after Will's big coming out scene in the last episode, and I liked the sentiment of this scene. It kind of reminded me of the coming out scene in general. I liked the sentiment of it, but I thought that the execution of it was a bit corny, I'm not going to lie.
Still think we can be friends.
Friends? No thanks. Best friends.
And generally, I didn't think that this story beat about Will needing to come out in order to unlock his full potential, to conquer his fear and be able to truly take on Vecna, paid off that well, only because what we saw Will do in this finale was to take over Vecna and break one of his limbs. He helped in that final fight, but I don't think that what he did was anything more than what we've already seen him do this season. I didn't see a big power boost or something that said to me, oh wow, he's able to do things that he couldn't do before because he's finally let go of this fear. And again, that was sort of the narrative that was set up by the show itself. I think it almost was as good or weaker than what we've seen him do, being able to control Vecna in the past episodes this season. And I think that maybe if he had been able to take over the entire Mind Flayer and really stretch his power and what he was able to do, it would have been like, oh wow, so this is the potential that he's been having or hiding inside of him all along. But it just kind of seemed like more of the same. And I think that that may have been a bit of a missed opportunity, again, only because the show itself set up this scenario where Will's full potential has now been unlocked, and that he just kind of did what we've already seen him do before. Max did have a role to play. I was curious to see what the finale was going to do with her, because the situation that the writers put into place had her confined to a wheelchair, but she ended up getting pulled into the mind along with Elle and Kali and being able to act as sort of a spirit guide through Vecna's history. I feel like her story was largely finished last season and in the seasons previous. And this season, you know, she had the story beat of trying to get back from the coma, and she had all the stuff with Holly and Camazotz, but it doesn't feel like the Duffers really knew what to do with her after that. And so they just said, well, why don't we have Elle and Kali pull her in, and we'll have her play a bit of a part in that end game, in that, you know, in that scenario, that part of the end game. But then she was captured by the military, and then kind of, I guess you could say, sidelined until the end of the episode, until she could get her happy ending. So I think that Max is one of the show's best characters, one of the series' best characters, and Sadie Sink got a few moments to shine. But post Camazotz, I do feel like the Duffers said, well, you know, we don't really know what to do with her. Let's give her a bit to do, but we'll just save most of it till the end. Of course, one of the big questions heading into this finale was who's going to live and who's going to die. And we got a death fake out early on with Steve falling off of the radio tower, and it goes to black, and then it comes back from black. It's almost like they went to a commercial break, and Jonathan had caught him, and Steve was fine, and everybody was fine. And everybody was pretty much fine through the rest of the episode. There was another death fake out where Vecna was playing mind games with Hopper, and it made him think that he had shot 11, and that was a way to get them out of his mind. And I actually kind of wish we'd seen more of that from Vecna this season specifically, his ability to play mind games. Will referenced that before he came out in the last episode, saying that Vecna had shown him this, that, and the other thing. And I wish that we could have seen more of that, because I think that that is a pretty powerful ability for a supervillain, to be able to trick your mind into seeing your greatest fears. And I think it's one that if he didn't employ it more this season, I would have liked to have seen, for example, what it is that Will saw. that made him so afraid. But they didn't really explore that too much beyond what we saw with Hopper and Eleven. Now, I don't judge a show's impact and a finale's impact by the number of characters that it kills, but I was somewhat surprised that nobody really had a confirmed death by the end of this episode, because the cast was so big and there were so many people that it felt like were being set up to sacrifice themselves in the way that we've seen with Eddie and Bob in past seasons. Now, we don't know what happened with Eleven. Mike kind of speculates at the end of the episode that maybe Kali had survived and that she was able to escape and go live, in a secluded life away from everything, not with her friends, but also not part of a government experiment. But that is speculation on Mike's part. I think there's some details that might throw that into question, how Kali would have been able to do that. It feels like the Duffers, though, maybe, and I haven't read any of their post interviews, after the episode, they may have cast clarification on that. It seems like they want us to think that Elle survived, or very likely could have survived, but nobody else died in this massive fight, in this massive battle. The phrase "kill your darlings" is something that is thrown around creative circles when it comes to screenwriting and, cutting scenes, etc. But the Duffers really did not want to kill any of their darlings. They introduced a massive cast by the end of this finale, and everyone made it out. Was I thirsting for someone to die? Was I saying, like, I have a bloodlust that must be sated by the blood of Murray or whoever? No, but I do think that when you're setting up stakes like this, it is a little surprising on a dramatic level that there isn't at least one major sacrifice that has to be made. And let's talk about that massive battle, because like so many things this season, I think that it had an interesting premise but lacked execution, because it started as the group going into the abyss to battle Vecna. Then we got to see that memory in the cave, which is apparently fully explained in the Stranger Things stage play, and they showed us a little bit more. You kind of got the sketches of it, but not really the whole story behind that memory. And so then we see through Will that Vecna/Henry maybe isn't the big bad after all, that he was being used by the Mind Flayer, who made a big comeback. I said in the review of the last batch of episodes, well, what's going on with the Mind Flayer? Some people thought the Mind Flayer was gone. The Mind Flayer comes back, and Will says, well, wait a minute, you're not a villain, you're a victim of the Mind Flayer. Join us to fight the Mind Flayer. But then immediately after, Vecna says, no, I'm not a victim. I joined the Mind Flayer willingly. We're partners. He's not somebody who, traumatized me into helping him. And those are all interesting ideas. But the finale, it felt like they wanted to get through this battle so quickly that it ran through those ideas like literally one after the other. I mean, all of that, the reintroduction of the Mind Flayer, this question of whether Vecna is the victim, and then this confirmation that Henry and Vecna were just being partners with the Mind Flayer, that all happened in the course of about 2 minutes. And then they merged, and we got this big battle at the end with Henry inside, or Vecna inside, and the Mind Flayer in its ultimate form outside. And it just felt a bit rushed to me, because I like those concepts and the visuals with the Mind Flayer, Henry's lair turning into the Mind Flayer and that form. They were really striking visuals. I liked the look of it. But it didn't feel like the Duffers really wanted to commit the time to do it, I think, properly, or more properly, in my opinion. And this is just how I feel. I mean, this was the ultimate battle between good and evil, and I feel that the gang had less trouble defeating both Vecna and the Mind Flayer than they have had in previous seasons with what should be considered lesser opponents. I mean, you had a gang of about 10 to 12 people with conventional weapons, flamethrowers, guns, knives, and they were able to hold their own against the Mind Flayer, which was bigger than any villain we've ever seen. Meanwhile, Eleven and Will were kind of doing their mental game and defeating Vecna that way, and they were able to push him onto a big spike, which was enough to defeat him. I think the big triumphant moment that did work for me was Joyce getting to land the coup de grace and say, it was kind of an Aliens moment, an Ellen Ripley moment. You effed with the wrong family, and then a prolonged execution, a beheading with an axe that allowed each of the characters to reflect on the trauma that had been inflicted on them over the past years. That moment worked, and it seemed worthy of that bigger battle that we didn't really get. And I think that there was just so much that they wanted to do to wrap up the characters at the end of the series, that this battle almost became an afterthought. And we've seen that before, where they want to, creators want to give an emotional resolution, but they've also been building up to a big event, and that event feels like it gets short shrift. Game of Thrones certainly had those kinds of criticisms thrown at it. I like the result of this final battle, but I do feel like the battle itself left a little bit to be desired in its execution. Speaking of Ellen Ripley, Nancy went full 80s action hero. I mean, she was strapped down with every possible weapon you could imagine. She was a walking arsenal, and it's been an interesting journey for her, because she went from the character who was like, oh, I'm good at shooting a handgun, to I am literally as good of a soldier as the trained military soldier, Hopper, who I'm standing right next to. And it's crazy for me to think that she went from that back to a life as a reporter in a small town. You think that she would go join some mercenary squad in Borneo or something, but no, apparently Nancy, she did what Rambo couldn't do. She put her guns down and walked away. But I mean, they really did transform her into a true 80s action hero. And speaking of true 80s action heroes, let's talk a little bit about Linda Hamilton. I've said in the past 2 reviews that I really hoped that they had something special in store for her character, for Dr. K, and they really did not. I was so excited when I heard that Linda Hamilton was going to be part of this cast, and I just don't feel that they utilized her properly. The military, for me even, was pretty much a non-factor in this finale. They were an obstacle that sort of facilitated Eleven's possible sacrifice in order for the Upside Down to go away. But were they even really that much of an obstacle? I don't know. You had this great opportunity, I think, with her character, and they never really did anything with it. I didn't think she was a particularly formidable villain or a particularly interesting character. And I wish that the Duffers could have written something more interesting for her. Of course, we did see the destruction of the Upside Down. The needle drop was not the Butthole Surfers, as Mike wanted, but Prince, which was, a very expensive licensing choice for the Duffer Brothers. Maybe that's where a lot of that money for this final season went. And so the bomb was exploded at the Upside Down Hawkins lab. The Upside Down itself was destroyed and disappeared forever, unless they want to do a spinoff in 5 or 10 years. And Hawkins somewhat returned to normal. It looked like they were covering up the existence of the Upside Down and everything by saying that there was a giant earthquake that killed all of these people. It seems like half the town knew what was going on by the end of the series, but I guess everybody just decided to roll with it. The interesting thing to me was that, the military was all still there in Hawkins when everything went down. You had people in Nancy and Hopper that had literally killed uniformed military soldiers, multiple uniformed military soldiers, but maybe there was like a non-aggression pact that everybody signed. Everybody just got to go back to their normal life. No real ramification that we saw. Maybe Dr. K and her whole operation were so secret that they couldn't really take any action, but the whole military presence and the fact that they just kind of, I just imagine them sitting there after the Upside Down collapse and just shrugging their shoulders and going like, okay, well, pack it up, I guess, just rebuild or whatever. I think that you could have maybe addressed that a bit more, because the military was built up as such an obstacle from the very beginning of the series. I was curious to see where Kali's storyline went, and I thought when I reviewed the last batch of episodes that they might be setting something up for a revelation of some sort. They didn't really. She really just kind of had her mind made up by listening to Hopper talk about the promise of Eleven's future life. Now, maybe I'm a little too jaded, but when she was killed off early-ish in the episode in a way that I thought was kind of without a whole lot of fanfare, when you have a character whose ability is to cast illusions, I did not believe for a second that she was actually dead. And when Eleven did her disappearing act, in my head, I speculated that Kali might be behind it, and maybe that is the escape hatch for how to potentially let Eleven escape. This whole storyline of her returning and going back to season 2 and devoting so much time in this final season to her and Eleven, I felt like she was used for exposition, and then as an ultimate sort of in-game tool, she had a use in getting Eleven away. But from a storytelling standpoint, I thought it was okay. To add that to the cast and to add that much complication to the season, it felt more of just like a plot reason for me, instead of any strong reason for her to be back among the cast. But I guess it did close that narrative loop, and for fans of the show and fans of that character, it gave you some resolution. I assume that she got swept away with the Upside Down, and I also assumed that those pregnant women that were in the Upside Down got swept away too, because they were all in the lab, so it sucks for them because, they didn't really sign up for that. But yeah, Kali, okay. So after the battle that defeated Vecna and Henry, a huge chunk of the episode was the Duffers giving endings for all of their characters. We flash forward 18 months. The gang was graduating from high school in 1989, and this had a very kind of Lord of the Rings feel. Because you were visiting different groups of characters who all kind of got their own endings. I've never really criticized Return of the King that much, because when you're ending a multi-movie arc or you're ending a multi-season show, it doesn't matter to me that when you get to the end that you want to have different endings for different characters. It just surprised me how much of a chunk of the overall episode this sort of epilogue consisted of. Dustin paid off his friendship with Eddie Munson by giving the graduation speech that I believe Eddie pitched that he had wanted to make before he died, a couple of years ago in story time. Great for Dustin, and I think that was a good evolution of his character. Too bad for the kids at the ceremony who might have wanted to walk the stage and do the graduation thing. But that's a very 80s thing where you have a big sort of like screw the man type thing and everybody claps. So that doesn't bother me. That's just a convention of the 80s things. Mr. Wheeler was at the graduation, and he even got to say a word.
Language.
But then I thought back to the past 6 years.
But it was still only Mike that got to exchange words of love and support with his mother. So as always, Mr. Wheeler, barely an afterthought. Max and Lucas ended up together, which is pretty much all we learned about their future, but I'm happy for them. They're a good couple. Steve Harrington wound up as the high school or junior high baseball coach and sex ed teacher in Hawkins, while all of the other kids scattered. I like that Robin was able to get back to the DJ booth and talk us into this epilogue, but unless WSQK is a talk radio station, I can also imagine a lot of angry teens in Hawkins wondering, who is this strange woman and why is she yammering over my music for 5 minutes? It did feel a bit like a therapy session. Jonathan became a filmmaker and Nancy became a reporter, and they all vowed to meet up once a month in Philadelphia in a scene that reminded me a lot of the scene at the end of Wet Hot American Summer, where they all have a big conversation deciding when and where they're going to meet 10 years later. The result of that conversation was that they were all going to make it their beeswax to get to Robin's uncle's house in Philadelphia every month. Hopper and Joyce finally got their dinner date and Hopper proposed, so they end up together, possibly in Montauk, where they're looking for a chief of police with a record of drinking on the job, unexplained absences, and paramilitary operations against the U.S. military. And then we got, I think, what was the best part of this show. This really felt like a scene that the Duffers have either had written or have been writing for years. Mike, Dustin, Lucas, Will, and Max meet up in the basement for one last game of D&D. We end the show where it began. Mike gives all of his friends a wish or prediction for their future, and then they all put their character sheets on the shelf and walk away. They each get an individual moment and cede the basement to Holly and her friends and the next generation of D&D players. And this was a very satisfying, to me, emotional moment for all of these characters, the core characters. Of course, Max was not there at the beginning of the series, but she became part of that core. I thought that this was a more complete scene than we've seen throughout a lot of the finale. The dialogue felt sharper. The acting, I think, was generally on point. That's why I say it felt like a scene that the Duffer Brothers have had written for a while. Like they've known this is going to be the last scene of our show, and they've gone back and done revisions, because at times I thought that the dialogue this season wasn't great, or perhaps the actors weren't given enough time to make the right choices, but this felt satisfying. It was an emotionally satisfying scene for fans of the show. And, I've had a lot of mixed feelings about this season, and a lot of things that didn't work for me, and a lot of things that I think could have worked better, but at least they were able to get this final scene, in my opinion, right. It at least left you walking out the door feeling like they had done service to these characters and given you that emotional payoff, and that is so much of what a series finale is all about. Very few series are able to navigate things beginning to end without some mistakes, and especially final seasons. Final seasons are difficult. I don't think that this was a fantastic final season for Stranger Things, but I do think that it eventually was able to get the characters to a place where, as a viewer, I felt like I had some closure, and it was satisfying closure for me on their relationships with each other and what they'd gone through. It's weird to think about the journey with this show. It's been nearly 10 years since it debuted, and I remember this was a show that debuted right before San Diego Comic-Con in 2016, and I remember being there with Screen Junkies, and people were talking about this thing. Have you seen Stranger Things on Netflix? Did you watch this show, Stranger Things? Like, it was the buzz of Comic-Con, and I remember coming home and watching it and saying like, wow, that's a really neat little show. And then watching it evolve from that kind of neat little show on Netflix to this phenomenon that it became over the last several years. I mean, that is rare with a TV show. Stranger Things, whether you like this final season or not, I think is going to go down, or has to go down in the record books, as a show that really was able to generate an audience and a following and a devotion and a passion for the characters in a way that very few shows do. And I think that the Duffer Brothers and the writers and directors that worked with them have to be given a lot of credit for that. I don't think that the legacy of this show is going to be its final season. Yes, it was uneven for me. Yes, I do think that there were a lot of things that could have been done much better, but it wasn't so much that, to me, that it overwhelmed everything else that came before. And again, I think a lot of that is because while the finale wasn't perfect, they were able to deliver on a character level, which I think is what most people are looking for in a series finale. So if I'm rating Stranger Things Season 5 overall, I can't really say better than it's fine, but it's kind of a contented it's fine, because I was happy with where the characters were. Not necessarily one where, you know, I think that it puts a stain on the show overall, as some people feel the final season of Game of Thrones did for that season, or for that series. So yeah, we've reached the end of the journey with this gang of kids, at least for now, and there's talk of a spinoff, and I'm sure that there will be at some point, and when and where that's going to be or what it is, we'll find out in the next several years. But what did you think? What did you think of the finale? What did you think of the payoffs for the characters? Let me know down in the comments below. And as I mentioned at the top of this video, I am on the road, and I've said this in my other two videos this week. I'm currently dealing with a family situation, and this was the last of the videos this week that I felt like I needed to do in order to sort of keep the channel healthy and to keep, you know, my livelihood going for the week. But having said that, this will be the last video for me this week. I may be back for charts next week. I may not be. I'm not exactly sure right now. It just depends on what happens over the next several days. And I know that I haven't really said a whole lot about what's going on, and I understand that. I appreciate the people that have shown their concern. It is something that I will go further into at a time that I feel is appropriate. But I have heard from several people in the audience, many people as a matter of fact, that have just expressed their support, and I appreciate that. And like I said, it's not a great situation, but it's something that when you're a family, you do what you need to do, and you band together and you deal with it and you handle it, and that's what we're doing right now. So I will see you at some point next week. I'm not exactly sure when. Thank you for watching this video. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.